Hello, Internet. So Jordan Greenhall asked me to hit him up on identity. It's a serious issue, and it is important to me, and I take the challenge seriously. So I hope he doesn't mind the video response as a kind of high bandwidth answer. The word identity politics tends to be uttered as a slur in the media, so I'm assuming from the outset that most people are hostile to talking about social identity. I think some of this is blowback to Black Lives Matter, which is like the most successful grassroots organizing movement in a generation. They explicitly put identity front and center in their movement. But look, the US has had a long history of struggling and failing to deal with race and gender and orientation, age, class, geography, career, education, religion, disability, mental illness, etc., etc., etc. These aren't issues of identity politics. This is just basic civil rights. But dealing with any of these issues requires being honest about who we are, and that means taking identity seriously. And that's hard to do. It's hard work, and most people don't want to do it. And so complaining about identity politics has become the default way of avoiding this work. Okay, so I can't convince anyone to take identity politics seriously until we understand how we think about social identity. And I don't just mean the concepts we use to think about social identity, like race or class or gender. I mean, we really need to understand social identity as a collective cognitive mechanism. In other words, it's something that our brains do. So I have some slides for another project I'm working on where I go over this in some more detail. These aren't my theories. All these quotes are from standard introductory texts in the field. So the top quote here is from Bakiri's entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on social norms. This is from a section explicitly on social identity. So she says, social identity is basically a cognitive mechanism whose adaptive function is to make group behavior possible. Let me say that one more time. Social identity is a cognitive mechanism whose function is to make group behavior possible. We are able to perform in groups. We're able to act as groups. We're able to act within groups because of our ability to track, as a cognitive process, the map of social identity. So the big quote here on bottom is from Jenkins' social identity textbook. I think it's now in its 3rd edition. It's a widely used introductory text to social identity theory and the psychology of social identity. Jenkins explains that psychology of social identity involves the construction and maintenance of what he calls the cognitive map of the human world and our places in it. Or more simply, the map of who's who and what's what. This is what identity is about at its core. In order to do anything at all in the world, we need to be able to identify all the things in it, track what they're doing, and understand how those activities relate to all the other projects we're engaged in. So our brains maintain an elaborate cognitive model, call it the identity map, for tracking all the relevant things. That includes tracking ourselves and our own histories, but also the histories of others, all the people around us. But not just individuals, but also the identities of groups of friends, of families, how they're all interrelated, nations, ethnicities, businesses, brand names, and all the other social agents and social activities that matter for understanding who's who and what's what. Not just tracking the relevant people and the relevant groups, but also tracking the social trends and the important historical events and the important objects that make a difference. So the iPhone is a node in the social identity map, and that node has an influence over how we evaluate the people using it, right? Good, both positively and negatively. So not only does the object have influence over our identification of other people, but it also has an identity itself, its own history. Right? This is all part of the social identity map. This is the cognitive map of who's who and what's what that we're using to track all the things and their relationships. Building this map is one of the most complex computations that the brain performs. This is mostly performed in the prefrontal cortex. If you know anything about the brain, this is where a lot of the decision making, a lot of abstract reasoning happens in the front of the brain. This is also where we maintain models of ourselves and of others and of groups, and where we make social decisions. It's not coincidental that these are all processed by the same part of the brain, because these processes are intimately related. In fact, they might just as well be the same process. Understanding what to do, making decisions about how to act, is always done by consulting this very elaborate cognitive map of the identity of all the things and how they're related to each other. Building and maintaining this cognitive map is among the most important things that the brain does. It's what allows us to function in the social system. And nearly every decision that we make is made by consulting this map. Let me go ahead and read the quote here. This is Jenkins, 2008. At a very basic starting point, identity is the human capacity rooted in language to know who's who and hence what's what. This involves knowing who we are, knowing who others are, them knowing who we are, us knowing who they think we are, and so on. A multidimensional classification or mapping of the human world and our places in it, as individuals and as members of collectivities. It is a process, identification, and not a thing. It is not something that one can have or not. It is something that one does. It cannot be said too often that identification doesn't determine what humans do. knowing the map, or even just approximately knowing where we are, doesn't necessarily tell us where we should go next, although better or worse routes to our destination might be suggested. When I say the identity map, it's not just your self model, the model of who you are, which is part of it, but it's also the model of all the other social agents and their relationships. Right? So this is an elaborate cognitive model, and we consult this model for almost every decision that we make. Most people don't appreciate how overwhelmingly influential this social identity map is in our everyday behavior. So a typical objection goes like this: look, my decision to go to the bathroom is based on the contents of my bladder and not about my assessment of social identity. It doesn't matter who I am or who anyone else is. When you gotta go, you gotta go. And most people generalize from this. So they think that the decisions that we make are mostly based on a rational assessment of the situation and not about any cognitive model of my identity or anyone else's identity. So my favorite counterexample to this kind of objection is from the non-Oscar winning movie Hidden Figures from last year. There's a subplot in the Hidden Figures movie where one of the key mathematicians has to go to the bathroom every day like any normal human being, but because she's black, she has to go to the colored restroom that's on the other side of the campus, and it takes her 20 minutes to get there, and then 20 minutes back, and so she's gone for like an hour, and so her boss gets mad at her, and they don't realize that because of who she is, because of her identity and the social situation around that identity, she can't just use the same bathroom as everyone else, but she has to go through these elaborate measures. For her, her identity is an issue in going to the bathroom. And it just happens our social world is built around our identities. Nowadays, there's no colored restrooms, but trans people have an issue going to the restroom. For the vast majority of people have a straightforward gender identity, male or female, and for them, deciding which restroom to go to is not an issue at all. And look, there's a label on the door, so it's a very straightforward decision to make about which bathroom to go into. But if you're trans, the decision isn't so easy, and making either decision might expose you to social criticism or violence. So for a trans person, because they don't fit into these narrow social pigeonholes, making this decision becomes an important issue. Most of us have the privilege of not thinking about our identity to go to the bathroom, and for some of us, going to the bathroom is immediately an issue of social identity. Okay, but trans bathrooms is an identity politics issue, and I don't want to go down that road just yet. We need to understand that social identity is complicated not just because politics is complicated, but because the social map itself is a very complex system. So this is the next slide. This is also from Jenkins. This is just the next page. The matter is made more complex, however, by the fact that knowing who's who isn't merely a matter of neutral classification. Humans are generally not disinterested classifiers. This is spectacularly so when it comes to classifying our fellow humans and them us. Cognitively, classification is organized hierarchically. A and B may be different from each other at one level, but both members of the metacategory C. Classification is also hierarchical, interactionally and socially. One may be identified as a C in one context, but as an A in another. In addition, because identification makes no sense outside of relationships, whether between individuals or groups, there are hierarchies or scales of preference, of ambivalence, of hostility, of competition, of partnership and cooperation, and so on. From this perspective, identification and motives for behavior might seem to be connected. To identify someone could be enough to decide how to treat her. However, classificatory models of self and others are multidimensional, unlikely to be internally consistent, and may not easily map onto each other. Hierarchies of collective identification may conflict with hierarchies of individual identification, which means that the following might make complete interactional sense. I hate all A's, you are an A, but you are my friend. The point here is that social identity is not a simple mapping relation. The identity map is complex, multidimensional, internally inconsistent. It can be analyzed in many different ways across many different kinds of relationships. It's made even more complicated by the fact that we're emotionally invested in these relationships. So the identity map is this very complex, computationally intensive cognitive structure that we work very hard to maintain. All the decisions that we make are made by consulting the map, and all the observations that we make have to update this map in various ways. This is why identity politics is so controversial, because any addition or large change to the identity map has implications for how we evaluate and decide all the other things that matter to our lives. So identities matter to how we make decisions. They're central, absolutely crucial, to every decision that we make at every level of decision making. Both individual, private decisions and collective government decisions are all made on the basis of understanding all the identities at play. Sometimes these identities are very specific and almost apolitical. So my identification as a cat person or as a backpacker. These might matter a lot to me. They might put me in contact with lots of communities that I strongly identify with, that I find a lot of my friends in. Right? But these maybe don't rise to the level of global politics, where it becomes an issue for a fight. And so people have no problem identifying as a cat person or a dog person or whatever. People have no trouble identifying with these categories because the categories have very little impact on how we manage the social spaces. But the really big identities that cause all the hostility towards identity politics, especially things like gender and race, these are issues precisely because taking these identities seriously challenge the way that we manage social spaces. If we think seriously about the way that gender identity or racial identity and the influence that has on the wage gap, for instance, this would require making serious structural changes to the way we manage our lives. And it's easier to avoid these changes and to tell people to not express their identity. I'll go ahead and bury this in the video. I had a conversation a few weeks ago with Jim Rutt. Jordan, you know Jim. And Jim put forward the argument that identity politics was one of the worst things to happen to activist movements in this generation. That, for instance, Black Lives Matter made a big mistake by focusing on identity as the central issue. Jim instead advocated for assimilationist politics. Right? Jim suggested that if you conform the identity to the social expectations, right, if you get the jobs that society wants you to have and the education that they want you to have, and if you dress and act like they want you to dress and act, and you adopt the culture of the society that you live in, that's how you become successful. Jim actually referred to Martin Luther King as an example of assimilation politics as a success story. So I think this is a complete misreading of civil rights history. I think civil rights has always been advanced by explicit recognition of the identity categories that we represent and why it matters to take those identity categories seriously. So to be explicit, my argument is this. People are hostile to identity politics because taking identity seriously demands of us that we change lots of things about the way we operate our social systems and about the ways that we think about the world. Making these changes is hard. It's a lot easier to depend on your habits and your prejudices. Failing to confront identity is, I think, the biggest political challenge of our day. And this is not just about civil rights for any particular minority group, although every one of those fights is important to continue fighting. But the way that we resolve all of these challenges is by recognizing social identity as the central key to managing the social spaces. This is something that I don't think anyone has figured out yet. Even in the age of social media, where so much of it is focused on me and my appearance and the food that I'm eating, there's a lot of myself that appears on social media, but there's very little thinking about the organization of social identity as a collective cognitive process. So if I still have your attention, so these slides are part of a project I'm working on for developing an alternative governing model, where the model is grounded on social identification as the core process, not voting and not any kind of representative system. The system is meant to be democratic, and it's especially meant to protect the consent of the governed, associations, identifications, and expressions of identity that people voluntarily make. Our current governing systems are based on Enlightenment-era theories of action and freedom. They make specific assumptions about how human cognition operates and how human social systems organize. And those assumptions are still embedded in our governing systems, and they're hundreds of years out of date. A system of governance based on a modern understanding of the mind and social action would be based on social identity at its very core. So a governing system that extends the identification model would help us track all these identity relations, help us manage and remember and visualize what the social identity map looks like. We don't have any good tools for doing this. Facebook is maybe the most obvious tool we have for tracking social identity, but I have no clear picture of the organization of the network. I don't know where all the nodes are or how they're all connected up. I know who my friends are, but I don't have a picture of the model, and Facebook does not help me have a clear picture of who's who and what's what. We saw from this last election that Facebook does more to obscure and confuse than it does to clarify the social order. So what we need in a governing system, what we need in a social model, is one that understands the complex and inconsistent ways that we're mapping out all of the identities for all of the relevant agents and their relationships. Not just the relationships, but also the values and norms that attach to those identity categories, and how the whole thing fits together in a model that's useful for deciding how to act. We don't have any tools that even approximate this kind of functionality. We don't have any tools for managing the social identity map. And it's not because it's technologically challenging. In fact, once you understand what we're tracking with this map, I think it becomes pretty clear what a digital governance tool ought to look like. And I have more things to say about that in a different video. To even take a step in that direction, you have to understand the important role that identity plays in managing the social order. Hopefully this video was a brief introduction to why social identity matters, both politically, but also psychologically and historically. I obviously have a lot more to say about this, and I'll leave links in the comments for you to explore these ideas further. I hope it starts some discussion in the group. Thanks for your attention.